Immanuel Kant's ethics continues to be deeply influential, not only in ethical theory, where it continues to be one of the chief approaches to ethics, but also in practice. The entire body of law that prohibits discrimination of a variety of kinds largely rests on a Kantian foundation. Nevertheless, when we think about Kant's principles, and we try to apply the categorical imperative, whether in the form of the formula of universal law, or the formula of humanity, or the formula of kingdom of ends, we find that all sorts of issues arise. So let's think about what it means to approach organizations from a Kantian point of view. What kinds of issues arise as we think about how Kant's ethics would apply to organizations and life within organizations? First of all, let's turn to the formula of universal law. Act so that the maxim of your action is something you can will at the same time as a universal law. Kant's principle of universal law requires that we treat similar cases similarly. That means that differences in treatment have to be justified by differences in the cases. But of course the differences can't be trivial sorts of differences, particular differences, things like, well, that was me and this is you. And so if that kind of thing is illegitimate, well, what kind of thing is a legitimate basis for a difference in treatment? We have to decide what relevant similarities are and what relevant differences are. If I'm going to appeal to some difference between two people to justify treating them differently, it had better be relevant. It can't be because that one's named Bob, or because that one has slightly longer hair, etc., etc. It's going to have to be something that is actually relevant to the kind of thing that's at issue here, to hiring the person for that job, for example, or giving them the promotion, or admitting them to the university, or whatever it happens to be in that particular context. So we need to know what's a relevant consideration. On the basis of what kind of difference can I treat people differently in this situation? Hegel famously thought that Kant's ethics was completely empty. It was nothing but a formalism that had no application to the real world. Why? Because he said, really, it just tells us treat similar cases similarly. I can always say, oh, but the cases are different. This is this case, that was that case. And so unless we have some specification of what a relevant difference is, there is no content, Hegel said, to this sort of theory at all. Now, I think Hegel is wrong to think that Kant's ethics is completely empty, but it is true that we need a criterion of relevant difference. What would make a difference in this situation? And what would justify a difference in treatment? Until we can answer that, we don't know what the theory requires. And of course there are all sorts of issues about that. The entire question of whether and under what circumstances affirmative action programs might be justified is something that depends on how we specify those relevant similarities and differences. There are other kinds of issues that arise when we think about how to apply the formula of universal law to organizations. One of them is that it's not uncommon we find two people who are pretty much equally qualified for a job, or who seem equally good candidates for that promotion. Students who seem equally good candidates for getting into the university, or getting into the law school, or what have you. So how do we make those types of decisions? After all, we might say, look, I can't admit everybody here. One person has to get that promotion. One person is going to get the job. But here we've got several people, maybe, who are pretty much equally qualified. We can't find a relevant difference. Does that mean we can use subjective and particular determinations? Does it mean we have to flip a coin? What do we do in those types of situations? They come up much more frequently than you might think. In fact, in college admissions, it's often true that the vast majority of people who have applied could actually succeed at the university. We want the people who are going to improve their lives the most, let's say, by going to the university. We want those who are going to produce the best experience for everyone. And so we might think those are the most qualified students. We might think of some other way of measuring that kind of criterion. But whatever we do there, we're going to find that many more people meet that criterion than we can actually manage to admit. So how do we make the selection? What do we do? Another kind of problem arises when we look at the details of when cases are similar. I've said we have to have a criterion of relevant similarity and relevant difference. The difficulty is that sometimes those criteria turn out to be immensely complicated. People often, at tax time especially, think about people who are in similar circumstances who pay very different taxes, or people in different circumstances who end up paying the same sort of tax, and we say there's something strange about that. But how do we decide what's a fair taxation to impose on any given person or on any given company or organization? It turns out that's an immensely complicated question, and trying to answer it and say what exactly are similarly situated taxpayers, for example, turns out to produce an immense body of tax law. The US Code is huge, and the same thing is true whether we think about taxes or the criminal law or the law of torts. All of these become immensely complicated as we're trying to sort out what the relevant similarities and differences are. Now, maybe we need to do that. On the other hand, the law can become so complex that nobody can understand it anymore. No one, for example, can actually be an expert in administrative law in the United States. It's far too vast. Even if we take specific areas of the law, like, for example, the part of the law that's relevant to corporate taxes, let's say, it turns out that that is vast and immensely complex, so much so that no one person can master it. Every year around April 15th, the Wall Street Journal sends a hypothetical tax return to various IRS offices around the country and says, please help. How much tax does this person owe? And they delight in reporting that no two offices actually came back with the same number. They end up having different computations, so even the IRS cannot agree what the legitimate and proper taxation amount is for people who are exactly in the same circumstance. Well, if all of this is true, if as soon as we try to be precise about similar cases and differences that would justify differences in treatment, it turns out we may produce vast bodies of law that are so complicated no one can understand them. What do we do about cases like that? Presumably at some point we say, look, it's all just getting too complicated. We've got to go with something similar, even if in some cases that leaves the boundaries either fuzzy so that we have to rely on people's judgment, or is going to produce the wrong outcome in certain cases. In short, there's a trade-off between, you might say, moral precision and comprehensibility here. And if we go in one direction, we produce vast bureaucratic structures that no one understands. If we go in the other direction, well, there's a lot of individual judgment required, and we're more likely perhaps to make mistakes. But of course, if no one understands the rules, we're likely to make mistakes there too. And so there are complicated trade-offs here between precision and complexity. There's another problem that arises in organizations. Is it acceptable to give preference to people who are in-house? Let's say for promotions or for jobs. Somebody's already working for the company, or perhaps they've worked for them in the past. Does that give them an edge? How do we judge similarity? Is working for the company now a relevant difference in this context? Well, we might think that it is. After all, if you already work for the company, we know a lot about you. If you're applying from the outside, we know less about you. And that seems like a relevant difference. Even if you look absolutely similarly qualified to somebody coming in from the outside, we have a much higher degree of confidence of our judgment of your level of ability because we've had so much greater opportunity to judge. Moreover, it may be good for the organization to make people feel that they can be promoted from within. If people feel that there is a path to success within the company, they're likely to want to stay within the company, feel loyalty to it, feel dedicated to it, be willing to work harder for the company. If they think, on the other hand, this is just a way station, I'm unlikely to get promoted here, I have to leave the company in order to gain a promotion or to get a higher salary or to expand my job opportunities, then their commitment to the company is much less. They're likely to work less hard, they're likely to feel much less loyalty. Let's turn now to the formula of humanity, which requires that we treat people as ends in themselves, with respect to their moral agency, rather than using them merely as means. How does that apply to organizations? Well, we have to think about what it is to use someone as a means within the organization. After all, typically people are present in the organization because they're a means to an end for the organization. So everybody's being used as a means, but Kant says, well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that in principle. It's a question of whether they're being used merely as means. Are they being treated with respect? Are they being treated as ends in themselves? There are tricky questions here about what it means to treat someone with respect, about what it means to use someone merely as a means, and so there are hard questions on the borderline there. We could agree that a certain level of concern and respect for people is required, and some organizations routinely do that, some really don't, and treat people merely as means. So treating people with a kind of, not just kindness and generosity, but with respect for their right to make certain choices. That's something that seems morally important within an organization. Still, it's hard to say what people should rightly, morally object to about the way they might be treated in an organization. A lot of people feel treated unfairly if they're not given a raise, for example, or if they're passed over for a promotion and so forth. Now, those things aren't in themselves immoral. Not everybody who wants to be promoted can be promoted. Not everyone who wants a raise can get a raise, and so on. Nevertheless, there are considerations there, partly in terms of comparisons with others. That's the realm of the formula of universal law. Hey, that person got promoted and I didn't, but we're equally qualified, and so on. But partly it's a question of being treated with respect as a member of the organization rather than merely a tool of the organization. And so there are many ways in which that can be manifested within an organization, and it's worth some deep reflection about what's involved there. What does it mean for a company or any other kind of organization to simply exploit the people within it, or for that matter, to exploit its customers? And there's another tricky question here. Deception, coercion, we could agree that those violate Kant's formula of humanity. But what about withholding information? What about issues of transparency? Withholding relevant information from people, information that would be vital to making a rational decision, we typically think of as immoral, as violating this condition, as disrespecting someone's rational agency. But within a company, there may be limits to transparency. A company may reasonably want to hold certain things as trade secrets, for example. It may not want to release salary information so that people can compare their salaries with others and thereby generate lots of complaints and lots of feelings of unfair treatment. So what exactly is required for proper transparency? A company can be too willing to withhold information, but also too willing to release information. And so it's a hard question to say exactly what kinds of transparency are required and when it's legitimate for a company to hide certain bits of information. Next week we'll talk about that in a more general setting when it comes to issues of bluffing or deception or other ways in which companies hold back information in a wide variety of business contexts. What do we do about moral conflicts? Kant thinks that because he's giving you one principle, you'll never face a moral conflict. You can always appeal to the principle to decide what to do. But it's not so clear that that's correct. Suppose you've promised that you'll keep something a secret, and then someone directly asks you whether you know about something. Let's say, for example, that your boss tells you, look, we're going to have to make cutbacks. 30% of the people in this department are going to be laid off. You will not be one of them, and I'm letting you know so that you can prepare, and because it's important to your plans for the coming year that we will have 30% fewer people. But don't let anyone else know. The official announcement will come out in 2 weeks. I want to prepare everyone, and I want to be able to make the announcement in a way that, explains what's going on and does not reveal too much information. And you say, my friend Carol, is she going to be one of the people laid off? And the boss looks at you and says, well, I didn't say anything, but yeah. Okay, so you promise to keep that a secret. And then Carol comes up to you a couple of days later and says, I've heard rumors about cutbacks that are coming up. Do you happen to know whether that's true? And do you know if I'm going to be one of the people laid off? What do you do? That looks like a hard conflict, and it looks like a conflict you can face as a result of your obligation to keep your promise, to keep that secret, but also, you might say, you don't want to tell Carol a lie, and so be honest, but also keep that secret. Looks like they come into conflict here. So what do I do? And what factors are relevant to deciding what I do? Appeal to the categorical imperative, or to treating Carol or the boss with respect or something like that, by itself doesn't seem to help very much. And so you might think that, in the end, the Kantian principle, first of all, doesn't make it impossible to face conflicts. We can still face them all the time. And secondly, it doesn't give you much guidance. I say, well, whatever I do here, I should be willing that everyone do in similar cases. even if I were the person involved. But then I think, well, if I were the boss, I'd want me to keep the secret. If I were Carol, I'd want to know. So what should I do? You might think, Kant isn't helping me very much here decide what to do. And so there are all sorts of conflict situations like that that can arise within organizations. And often appeal to the Kantian principle by itself doesn't really seem to help. Now sometimes it might. Sometimes you might think, look, I can't really treat that person with respect unless I divulge this information. I can't really treat that person with respect unless I keep that secret or keep that promise, etc. But sometimes it feels as if there's really a clash. And then it's really hard to use the formula of humanity or the formula of universal law to help us. Another problem. What if the survival of the group depends on using some people merely as means? Spock in Star Trek used to say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Well, what if we think of it that way? What if we think, for example, luckily in most organizations it isn't a life or death question, but of course it might be a survival of the organization question. It might be, look, I realize taking all these people who've worked for the company for years and laying off a bunch of them, that really feels like I'm just using them merely as means to get to the balance sheet and to let the company survive. But if we don't do it, everybody's going to lose their job because the company won't survive. Or in the military, it becomes very clear. We need some people to be the first to hit the beach. Their chances of being killed are much, much higher. And yet, the success of the war effort depends on this. If we don't take that beach and don't manage to actually push the enemy back, we're going to be in deep trouble and we're not going to survive. So we've got to use some soldiers out there, even knowing it's basically a suicide mission for them, in order to attain the objective and help all of us survive. Well, in that case, it really does feel as if you're treating people merely as means, using them as simply ways of getting onto that beach. And so, what does it mean to talk about respecting moral agency in a situation like that? Does Kant's principle require simply that we not survive? Or can we set that up in some way that we can say, well, we're treating them with respect? Now, you might say, look, we're looking for volunteers to be the first onto the beach. Maybe that'll work. But what if everybody says, well, that's suicide. I don't want to be among that first group. Then what? Presumably some people have to be ordered to do it. And in that case, it looks a lot like their rational agency is not being respected. They instead are being used merely as means. Well, maybe that's true, or maybe it's not. We again need to specify pretty carefully what counts as respect, what counts as using someone merely as a means. But in addition to that, we might think, look, there are cases perhaps where organizations or even lives are at stake. Survival is at stake. And in those kinds of contexts, we might simply have to use certain people as means. If we don't use them merely as means, then the entire organization is not going to exist. There are interesting questions about gratitude. Often people who are not shown gratitude really end up feeling used. They feel as if they have been treated merely as means. And so maybe respect requires showing gratitude. W.D. Ross listed among his 7 fundamental principles, be grateful. And he wanted people not only to feel gratitude, but express gratitude to people who had done them a kindness. Now, I think gratitude is immensely important in life. Not only the expression of gratitude to individual people, but a sense of gratitude for life itself. So I agree with Ross that that's pretty fundamental. But it does seem to have, in addition to that, an interesting connection to respect, because we tend to think that we're not being treated fully as a rational moral agent. We're not being treated with respect if people don't express gratitude to us. So if an organization simply never shows its employees or its customers gratitude, then you might think, I don't feel respected by that organization. Now, in a way, we can say simply, okay, so respect requires gratitude. But first of all, it doesn't feel that intuitive that there's such a connection, though I think there is, and I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. But secondly, what exactly is required for that expression of gratitude? Suppose the company once a year sends everyone a thank you note. Does that fulfill the obligation? What if it throws an employee luncheon once a year? Some companies do that, and sometimes, hey, that's great. People feel respected as a result of that. Other times, people feel as if, well, that's a token, and if anything, their feeling of disrespect increases as a result. So what does it really mean to show people gratitude? It's a hard question, and I think it's worth deep reflection. One more worry about what it means to treat employees with respect. Some companies rely heavily on temporary employees, on seasonal employees, on others who really don't have permanent jobs with the company. And you might worry that that status itself is a sign of disrespect, of using someone merely as a means. Now I think we can say, well look, those people are engaging in this seasonal or temporary employment voluntarily, and so I don't see why that is treating them with disrespect. They are, after all, doing this of their own free will. They're not being coerced, they're not being deceived, and so forth. Now, it would be one thing to say, oh yes, you're very likely to get a permanent job with the company, when, in fact, you're not at all. Yes, that would be deception, that would be treating you merely as a means. But what if it's obvious? This is seasonal employment. You're working at the amusement park for the summer, or you're working for the month of December, leading up to the big Christmas rush, or you're working for the IRS in the spring, preparing for that April 15th deadline and helping them deal with the crush of returns that comes in around April 15th. Well, all of those things are known to be seasonal, and so it doesn't seem as if that's a sign of disrespect. On the other hand, what if the company does this more than it really needs to, relies heavily on temporary employees, seasonal employees, and so forth, when in truth a lot of those could be turned into more permanent positions? Is that a sign of disrespect? Would respect require hiring as many people on permanently in the company as you possibly can? I don't think it's easy to answer that question. And so even though we could say, look, seasonal employment, temporary employment, and so on, those aren't intrinsically disrespectful. It's not intrinsically exploitative. Nevertheless, under certain circumstances, maybe it is. Finally, then, let's turn to the formula of the kingdom of ends. We're to act as legislating members in a kingdom of ends, where everybody treats everyone else as an end in themselves, not merely as means. Okay, so we do this. We think of ourselves as legislating for that entire group. What is an organization? What is a group? Well, it's a group of people organized to achieve a certain end for a certain purpose. Kant talks about the kingdom of ends as having a systematic union of ends, not only in that we're all treating one another with respect, but I think in an organizational context, it becomes, yes, we have that in common, and we also have in common the purpose of the organization. As an employee, I am dedicating myself to play my role in fulfilling the mission of the organization. But now, several things are going to follow from that. One, if we're to have an effective systematic union of ends, it better be pretty clear to people what the objective is. What is the goal of the organization that I'm supposed to be dedicating myself to? I need to know that. Hence the importance of things like mission statements, value statements, things of that kind that articulate what the purpose of the organization is. Now, as soon as you look at what real organizations do when they formulate mission statements or value statements, you can quickly become cynical, because it looks as if people sit down and just say a bunch of nice things. Oh, we want to be this, and we want to be that, and that, and that, and this, and so on. Now, sometimes organizations have very clear missions. It's just, we are in the business of this. But often it isn't like that at all. People will list 4 or 5, or sometimes 10 or 15 things that they hold as values and things that are objectives of the organization. My own university has a list like that. So periodically I've asked students, so what are they? What are the missions of this university? What does it articulate as its goals? What are its purposes? And I found that people can't name more than 1 or 2 of them. And I mean a group of 90 can't name more than 1 or 2 of them together. Not that each one only has 1 or 2. I'm not really any better off. I can't tell you right now what they are. That's a problem. When there's one, people know what it is. It can be articulated clearly and people understand that's the purpose. If there are 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, people are going to remember 1 or 2. If, on the other hand, there are 15 or 20, first of all, people will not remember what they are, and secondly, they're constantly going to be coming into conflict with one another. So it's important to maintain that systematic union of ends. It's easy for an organization to forget what business it's in, what its purpose is, and it's hard to communicate that purpose to individual people and inspire them to seek that purpose. So you better articulate it clearly. So I do not mean to say that mission statements, value statements, and so on are unimportant. On the contrary, I think they're very important. But I also think the average organization does a really bad job of articulating what that is. A last point. The formula of the kingdom of ends, Kant takes to be, in the end, equivalent to the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity. But you might think that actually it is in some tension with it. After all, to promote that dedication to a systematic union of ends, to promote the idea that people are seeking the goal of the organization and treating other members of the organization as fellow members of this joint enterprise, we have to inculcate some feeling of in-group loyalty. We have to actually say, look, the members of this organization are special. They are dedicated to achieving that goal. And that seems to be in some tension with the idea that we are to act as legislators of a universal law. Not just a universal law within that kingdom, but a universal law in general. After all, you might think, I am to act as a legislator in the kingdom of ends. That is to say, someone who is making rules that are universal within that kingdom. It's another thing to think, I am going to act according to maxims that I can will as a universal law, or even a universal law of nature, that applies within that organization and outside that organization, within this kingdom and outside of it. You might think, look, there are cases where building up that systematic union is one that isn't just a matter of, hey, I treat my employees the way I would treat anyone, but instead saying, I try to make my employees feel special. I might, for example, give people who are in-house some preference in promotions, in getting positions within the company, in advancing. I might do things that are special for my employees in a variety of other ways. I treat my employees differently from the people who are not my employees, not only in that I pay them and give them office space and that type of thing, but also in that I am going to give them preference of various kinds. You might think the same thing happens at all sorts of levels. At the level of a country where citizens treat one another differently from the way they treat non-citizens. You might think it happens within other kinds of organizations, within families. We treat family members differently from the way we treat people who are not members of the family. And in all those cases, we might say this formula of the kingdom of ends is in some tension with the formula of universal law. The universal law formula seems to be pushing us toward treating people equally, whether or not they're a member of the in-group. But the formula of the kingdom of ends seems to suggest that we want to cultivate and promote and act as if we have a systematic union of ends within a certain group, within an organization. And you might worry that at certain points those things come into conflict with one another. Now, Kant thinks in the end they don't. But in an organizational context, it often feels as if they do. The question of giving people preference for positions to if they already work for the company, that's just one manifestation of something that can arise across the board. Many companies give employees special pricing, for example, or do things in other ways that give people special perks because they work for the company. It seems like a legitimate and in fact a good thing to do from the point of view of promoting a systematic union of ends. But it raises questions when we think about the formula of universal law. Well, I hope I've given you some idea of how complicated it becomes when we try to apply Kant's principles to real-life organizations. Sometimes these considerations are very helpful. Other times, we end up having to face hard problems. But from a Kantian point of view, they're essential problems. We need to face them in order to decide what to do.